right, Richard, we're ready to go.
Hello to everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled Code Red, Climate Crisis and Migration. We'd like to thank you on behalf of the ABA. I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar, which we think is very timely, considering the events in the United States and in Florida recently. The webinar is sponsored by our section, the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. And for more information on this section, if you're interested in more webinars that are free or just information, feel free to visit us at americanbar.org/CRSJ, Civil Rights and Social Justice. I'm Richard Pena. I'm going to be today's moderator, and I'm vice chair of the section's Immigration Committee, which is a committee that's spearheading this webinar, and we've put it together. And we're very excited with the speakers that we have and the timeliness of the webinar. And we're excited to have you visiting with us today. We certainly hope that it will be beneficial to you, and we think it will. But before we begin, we have some remarks from the ABA President, Deborah Enix Ross, which we would like to present now.
Deborah Enix Ross, President of the American Bar Association. And I'd like to welcome and thank you for attending this webinar. Climate change is an existential threat to our world and one of the greatest challenges of our time. The associated legal and human rights issues are manifold, requiring strong and effective attention from lawyers and bar associations. As the nation's leading organization of lawyers, the ABA is committed to its leadership role to combat climate change. By educating our members, advising our clients, advocating before our governments, and raising awareness, the ABA is making a difference. We call on all lawyers everywhere to join us. The multitude of resources and opportunities provided by the ABA are what makes us the largest, most diverse, and most prominent organization of lawyers in the world. This webinar provides what the ABA routinely offers our members, an opportunity to learn from and collaborate with leading lawyers and thought leaders to build our knowledge, hone our skills, and to work together on issues of common concern. Our vibrant, member-driven organization could not serve as the voice of America's legal profession without you and your participation at events like this. The ABA needs the support and participation of all lawyers so we can benefit from diverse perspectives and demonstrate that we stand united as a profession. If you're an ABA member, I thank you for your support. And if you're not an ABA member, I encourage you to visit ambar.org/join and consider joining us. That's ambar.org/join. And here's another request. On social media like LinkedIn and through your professional connections, please spread the word to your colleagues, especially to the young lawyers and law students you know, about your experience with this webinar and how your involvement in the ABA enhances your work and service to the public. Thank you for your continued outstanding work and dedication that makes our legal system strong and justice under the rule of law a reality for all.
Our thanks goes out to President Enix Ross for taking the time to share that message with us. And I think we can all agree that climate change is upon us, and it is one of the biggest challenges of our time. I remember hearing, and you probably do too, when we were told that climate change is coming, it's coming, but we always thought, well, it'll be here someday. Well, it's here now. And we have extreme conditions with greater frequency, not only in the United States, but also globally and around the world. And as we mentioned, Ian, and in Florida, we have floodings, and Southwest, we have droughts. Arctic ice is disappearing, and it affects us all. I mean, sometimes we know about it and it's reported, other times it's not. I saw recently a small little article on Pakistan, how 1/3 of the country is submerged in floods. So, but it's here today. Today's speakers, climate change has many aspects to it. It's very deep and it's very broad. You're going to be hearing from today's speakers some of those aspects that maybe you've never heard before. We have two international speakers, one from Canada and one from India, both lawyers and environmental experts. And then we have the US perspective. We'll be talking about internal migration, external migration, and you'll also be hearing how climate affects people, both physically and psychologically. And that may hit home for you because we'll share some of the mitigation things that you can do. Now, from a housekeeping standpoint, before we get started, and during today's program, we're going to encourage you to ask questions of our panelists. Now, at the bottom of the screen, you should have a Q&A function, and please use that. And feel free to do it as they're talking. We'd also encourage you to put their name if you want a question for Brian or any of the others. Just put their name so that we'll know who to address it to. And we're going to try to get to as many as we can. Please bear with us if all are not answered, but we'll do our best. Something else that you need to know is that we will share the recording with everybody that's registered. And so we'll be sending that to you after the program. And please feel free to distribute it widely. We just want to get the word out on what we're doing. Now with that, we're going to talk about, let me talk about the speakers that you're going to be hearing today. And we're going to begin, Brian Buttigieg is a partner at Miller Thompson LLP in Canada. And not in the order of their speaking, but another speaker we're going to have is Dr. Lisa Doggett, family physician, co-founder of the president of Texas Physicians for Social Responsibility. And Dr. Doggett is in Austin, Texas. We'll be hearing from Dr. Elizabeth Ferris. Now, Dr. Ferris is a research professor and director of the Institute for the Study of International Migration from Georgetown University, Walsh School of Foreign Service. And then another speaker, the fourth speaker we have is Sanjay Notani. And Sanjay is a partner of economic law practice, and he is an expert in India. He's an Indian lawyer, and he will be also speaking on some perspectives from India. Let me begin by, Brian's going to be our first speaker, and Brian's recognized as one of the leading practitioners on environmental law in Canada, and he specializes in environmental law. He's a regular speaker at conferences on environmental law. As a matter of fact, he spoke at one of the prior panels that I was moderating, and that's why I asked him to come back. He has written extensively and published in law and industry publications, and we're really pleased that he is going to be with us. And Brian, thank you for being with us today. It's an honor to have you. Now, I know that you're going to go through some slides, but I was wondering if you could begin with your discussion by talking to us about the unique challenges that Canada faces in its international climate change commitments. Like most countries, we have commitments. And tell us about Canada, our neighbor, and some of the unique challenges that it is facing.
Sure. Thank you, Richard, and thanks everybody for attending, and thanks also to the ABA section of the Civil Rights and Social Justice for organizing this. Let me start in seeing how technologically adept I am and see if I can share my screen or not. Richard, am I sharing the correct screen?
Yes, you're good.
Are you seeing? Okay, great. So let me just flip over to go over to answering your question. In terms of unique challenges for Canada, I like to start a question like this with a quote that's almost 90 years old at this point, but still quite true, from one of our former prime ministers, that if some countries have too much history, we have too much geography in Canada. And it is a combination of that very little history and very large amount of geography that does pose some unique problems for us, both in terms of our international commitments and also some of the other topics that I hope we'll talk about today dealing with climate change. But here's the little bit of history and the lot of geography that combines to make this a difficult problem for us up here. Canada was formed in 1867 as a federation, which means there is a central government lawmaking authority, and there are also 10 provinces with lawmaking authority. And in 1867, in our Constitution, a list was given, a list of powers to the federal government and a list of powers to the provinces. And each was supposed to run their own laws in accordance to that list. Being 1867, important things were given to the federal government, such as the postal service and the railways. Nobody mentioned the environment in any of these in these lists. As a result, constitutionally, we do not have a clear demarcation between the federal government and the provinces on who is responsible for environmental law. What tends to happen is the federal government is responsible for signing international treaties, because that was one of their powers. However, when it comes to implementation, it comes down to often a very loose term in the provincial list, which is called property and civil rights, and also in terms of some other natural resource regulations. So implementation of these treaties is often very much a function of provincial rules. And here's where the geography comes in. And hopefully you can also see my cursor as we move through, as I kind of jump around a little bit in our geography. On the East Coast, we have the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, which was historically a fishing community dependent on fisheries, and today has pretty vast offshore oil reserves. Its economy depends very much on exploiting those oil reserves. On the other coast, on the West Coast, we have British Columbia, whose coastal, with a very fragile coastal ecosystem and a local population and a very strong and vocal Indigenous population who are very much determined to do their best to preserve that coast and protect it. And therefore, there is a fair amount of political opposition to increased oil shipping and to increased any oil extraction, increased pipeline deliveries. So two coasts with two completely different interests. In the middle, you have Ontario and Quebec, who have really not much in terms of natural resources such as oil, and whose power supply, energy demands, mostly come from things like nuclear. Ontario is about 50% nuclear. The large balance of the remainder is hydroelectricity. So you can imagine their policies on climate change and energy are going to be quite different from those in Newfoundland and those in British Columbia. On the other hand, you also have Alberta, which is completely landlocked, which has enormous oil reserves, which, however, it's powerless to exploit them in some ways because of the limitations on transmission. Very difficult to build new pipelines, very difficult to move it by rail is about the only real practical alternative at the end of the day. And Saskatchewan and Manitoba were very much Canada's breadbasket, large farming communities, enormous farms. And so the bottom line is, Richard, when you look at all of these competing interests, every one of these provinces is going to have a very different agenda as to how they want to tackle climate change, and often their competing interests. And that makes it really difficult for us on the world stage to make a promise we could make, but then to effectively try to keep it in the long term because of these changes. So that is a quick overview of our history and geography and how it impacts our ability to deal internationally with climate change.
Well, thank you for that eye-opening analysis. The seminar, part of the seminar is on migration, and can you tell us how climate migration is likely to impact Canada?
Sure, and we stick to the geography. We stick once again to yet another map of Canada. This is a population density map. which is, and I'm not sure the resolution of my screen to you, so I have put a bit of a code down at the bottom of the map as well. Just take a look at the colors and take a look at the numbers. If you look really carefully, you might see some red towards Southern Ontario area. That is a population density of greater than 500 people per square kilometer. If you look at the purple, which seems mostly near Alberta and Manitoba, 0.4 to 1 people per square kilometer. And look at all that white, and that is less than 0.4 people per square kilometer. We are an empty country. We have a huge amount of geography and very little people living there. Now, from a migration point of view, again, our geography, where we are in the world, makes it really unlikely that people, vast numbers of people, are going to walk across the border to us or are going to come in by sea. We have an Atlantic Ocean on one side, Arctic Ocean on the north, and the Pacific Ocean on the west. We are pretty well naturally, if you like, defended from migration that is unregulated at the end of the day. I haven't heard much rumors of people migrating north from the United States, Richard, but every now and then there are threats of people wanting to do that for other reasons. But generally speaking, you see that we don't have the same problem that, say, the United States has at its southern border, or that many European countries have, especially with their borders with Asia Minor or with North Africa at the end of the day. So it's quite different that way. At the same time, Canada, because of its very small population, depends on its survival on controlled migration. We need, as a country, more people to come here because our birth rate is low, our population is aging, so we actively encourage migration. And as you can see, it looks like we have a lot of room. Now, the interesting question for me is, all that space that you see white, the question is it really habitable or not, especially with climate change? Understand the vast majority of that land is really covered right now still by boreal forest, except for the far north that is north of the tree line. When the first settlers came to Canada in the 18th and 19th century, their impression was this was a great place to farm and a great place to live because look at all those trees, this must be good farmland. It turns out most of Canada is covered by effectively a shield by the Earth's crust, and only a few inches in many parts of topsoil is sustaining all that forest. Take down the trees, the topsoil washes away very quickly, and you're left with bare rock. So the question for me is, even with all that land and even with that desire to encourage migration, how much of this country is going to be genuinely habitable? There are obviously enormous problems of putting an infrastructure in a land so vast with still relatively small density. But at the end of the day, the question is also going to be, how much of this land is actually going to be habitable in the future? And that is very much, I think, an open question in the end. So the other thing I wanted to mention, just as a little note, because this is a recurring story that comes up in our news items, Richard. We're not talking large numbers here, but it came up again in a news item just a couple of days ago on our national broadcasting service. What you're looking at is a picture of the Canadian border between the province of Quebec and the state of Vermont. Well, that's our border. It's a line in the trees, just a tree cut. And it is, you know, our countries both proudly often mention that we have the largest undefended border in the world, the longest undefended border in the world. And obviously, there isn't much incentive for either of our two populations to illegally migrate across this border. But what has been happening, and we're talking relatively small numbers, a few thousand a year are apprehended. People coming in from South American countries, such as Mexico, who do not need a visa to fly into Canada, have been flying into Canada and then walking across the border into the US with a view of making a legal entry into the US. It's a small number at the end of the day, and the numbers we have are what's known simply from apprehension numbers by both Canadian and US border control. It potentially is obviously larger than that at the end of the day. But it is an interesting part of migration that it just showed the lengths to which people will go to get into the country of their choice. And so rather than worry about your southern border, some people are coming in through the north, which is often very surprising to people to hear.
You know, Brian, one of the things to follow up on the controlled migration that Canada and the need for more population, I was at an ABA panel a couple of years ago, and we had some Canadian immigration experts in one part of the government. And I don't know if it was tongue in cheek, but they said that if the United States didn't want the DACA folks, that they would take them en masse because they're already educated and they're intelligent folks and they could use them. So I've always remembered that. But moving on to another aspect about emissions. Emissions is a big deal in climate change, climate crisis. We know that. But can you talk to us about what GHG emissions are and how the climate change is going to impact that in Canada?
Sure, and yes, I think, Richard, the comment you made about migration is very true. You know, Canada really is, for some reason, people think we're a very cold country. Those of us who live here actually enjoy our winters, but you know, that again is likely to change over time. Let's talk a little bit about greenhouse gas emissions with yet another map. This is as much about geography as anything else. We're talking about our planet at the end of the day. This is a screenshot that I took from a Canadian government website from a couple of days ago, just October the 11th. And what it shows is the number of forest fires that were currently active 2 days ago in Canada. And again, you'll see, I don't want to go through too much on the code itself, but you'll see the hotspots were showing more than 30. And what the colored area, just to get, again, to orient you to the map, the entire colored area pretty much shows the area of Canada that is mostly covered, again, by forest. Other than the prairie provinces and the populated areas, which you really saw are really that little ribbon to the south with the border, the vast majority of this country is covered by forest, except you'll notice in the far north of the picture, where the sort of gray beigey area, well, that's north of the tree line. So that is not forest. However, it is basically tundra and permafrost. Now, what I want to draw your attention to is that even though our population is relatively small, we still have obviously our own contributors of greenhouse gas emissions through industry and fossil fuel burning, not to mention our fossil fuel extraction and the indirect effects that causes wherever those fossil fuels are burned. But probably our largest threat to the world's greenhouse gas emissions is our very own natural resources at the end of the day, our forests. As drought becomes more common, and as forest fires become more common and more prevalent, the carbon dioxide and methane emissions from those forest fires are going to increase. And there is, and again, I don't claim to be a forestry expert by any stretch, but there is a school of thought within forestry in terms of natural control of forest fires that historically forest fires are not a bad thing. And so within, say, our national parks and our provincial parks, what they found is that by extinguishing fires too quickly, they were preventing the growth of certain types of trees. They were effectively decreasing biodiversity, and there is a natural need for forest fires. So there is a case to say to not fight forest fires in some cases. However, as drought and other conditions increase the prevalence and the size of forest fires, the next problem becomes, even if you want to fight them, they are just too darn big to fight at the end of the day. So on that front, there is a potential for a very large contribution from Canada to the world's greenhouse emissions on something that is arguably not going to be very easy to control. It's one thing to control industrial emissions. It's another thing to say, how are we going to fight these fires and keep them under control? And then if you look at that beige area, that is not a benign area either. That permafrost is basically impacting a massive sink of frozen organic matter, which as that begins to thaw will itself contribute to a huge extent to carbon dioxide and methane. So in terms of Canada's problem for the world, our problem is, again, one created by our own geography at the end of the day, much more, I think, than from our own industries. And it's not one that you see a huge amount of public policy discussion on, certainly not in the popular media. And I think it's a potentially very difficult problem that we're going to have to confront in the next few decades, sooner than many people imagine.
That's cheering news. Brian, I know you have one more slide for us. We have about a minute left on your segment. And can you we know that you have freshwater resources and in abundance, and that's one of the things we know Canada for. But what is can you project what the impact of climate change on those freshwater resources might be in about a minute, please?
I will do it. I will do it quickly, Richard, with one last map for you all. And again, you don't really need to look too much at the detail. The bottom line is Canada has approximately 20% of the world's freshwater supply. A large amount of it captured in the Great Lakes, a large amount of it in lakes all across the country. It's impressive to fly over parts of the country and you see more water than land as you go over it. The problem is much of this is a result of the ice age and glacial melt. And we are seeing rapid decreases in our water supplies. The Athabasca Delta, the world's largest freshwater delta, is already shrinking dramatically. Our Great Lakes are effectively enormous puddles left over by the ice age. Their recharge is quite limited. There is huge pressure on the politically for especially the Southwest US to look to our resources as part of their solution for their water problem. And so our own resources are not going to be as abundant as they are, and the political pressure to actually utilize them is going to increase dramatically. And I'll leave it at that within the time limits, Richard.
Thank you, Brian. We really appreciate it and in your point of view. Thanks you very much.
All right, I am going to figure out how to stop my share screen there. Hopefully that is the case, and it's back to you.
Next, we have Dr. Elizabeth Ferris, and Dr. Ferris is an expert in her field. She comes highly recommended for this panel. She's written and edited 6 books. She's been published in academic and policy journals. Some of her publications include works on migration and climate change adaptation, and refugees and internal displaced persons. Beth, thank you for being with us today.
Oh, it's great to be here. I'm glad you're talking about climate migration. We need more people talking about it.
Can you guys start out by giving us a brief overview of what we know and what you know about climate change and migration, and also the things that we don't know?
Sure. I mean, we know that climate change is going to make parts of our world uninhabitable. And we know for millennia, people have moved in response to changing environmental conditions. This is a tried and true protection strategy, a survival strategy. So we know that lots of people are going to be moving as a result of climate change. You know, some of this will be due to sea level rise and coastal erosion. Some, as Brian just mentioned, the melting permafrost, which is really harming many indigenous communities in the Arctic, not just in North America, but also in other parts of the world. Part of it's due to drought, and these extreme heat periods are going to make parts of the world unfit for human habitation. We know that this movement is likely to take different forms. The UN Framework on Climate Change Convention, the UNFCCC, has said since 2010 that people will move in one of 3 ways. There will be migration, which we assume to be voluntary, and it may be anticipatory. People will see the harm that's coming and move before things become catastrophic. A second form will be displacement, and that we've seen, just in recent weeks with Hurricane Ian. Whenever there's a catastrophic storm or an intense drought, people move not because they choose to move someplace else, but because they're forcibly displaced. And in some cases, assistance will be provided. And some of those people in Pakistan or in Florida will go back home. But we don't know how many won't go back home. And the third form of movement that the UNFCCC talked about were planned relocations, when a whole community is moved from a place where they're at risk to a safer place. Much less research has been done on that third form of movement. We also know that it's never just climate change that makes people move. It always interacts with social, economic, demographic factors. We know that people with more resources may be able to adapt in place better. They can raise their house, put it on stilts if they live in a coastal area, or take other measures to protect themselves. People with fewer resources may find it impossible to move. We sometimes refer to those as trapped populations, people who would like to move, but don't even have money for a bus ticket or any place to go. We know that demographics will shape decisions to move. Younger people, healthier people are more likely to relocate, to move elsewhere than older people who are often more tired or have physical disabilities, which make that impossible. And there are different levels of risk tolerance. How much risk am I willing to assume to continue living where I am? So, these factors all interact with climate. I'm from Texas, I'm just like Lisa, and I have two sisters who live on the coast, and both of them have been displaced 3 times in the last few years by hurricanes. Both of them had flood damage to their houses. Now they're both middle class and had insurance, but it's a real hassle to go through that every year or two. And one of my sisters said, well, I've had it. I'm moving to San Antonio. And she did. And my other sister said, well, I can't move. My job's here. My family's here. My kids, even though the same environmental hazard, same socioeconomic conditions, and same family, and they made different decisions, so we really can't say that everybody's going to move given certain conditions. A final thing we know is that almost all of this movement is going to be within national borders. Just like people who are displaced by Hurricane Ian are probably not going to go to Mexico or Cuba or Canada. They're going to stay someplace within the United States. There's a lot of attention on cross-border movements, a lot of fear-mongering, I would say, of millions of people showing up at borders of developed countries because of climate change. But most of this is going to happen internally within countries, and most of it's going to be from rural to urban-ish centers, kind of like the processes of urbanization we've seen. And finally, the things we don't know. We don't know a lot about this. We don't know how many people will move, when they will move, where they will go. The estimates on the numbers range from 20 million to 1 billion people by 2050. The World Bank's probably done the best research on this, and says that up to 240 million people will move internally in the worst case scenario. But we don't know if our world can stop these greenhouse gas emissions and control global warming, or how bad it will get. The worse it gets, the more people will be forced to move. We also don't have data on people displaced by disasters, even in the United States. We don't know how many people were forced to leave their homes in Florida. We can look at applications for FEMA assistance, about 350,000 as of last week. But all those people, did they have to leave? Have they gone back home? Nobody keeps track of who's leaving and who's coming back. Hurricane Katrina in the US displaced 1.2, 1.3 million people. We do not know how many of those displaced people eventually returned to New Orleans. We've got figures of the population of New Orleans, but they're not the same people. A lot of people moved into New Orleans to take advantage of the construction boom after the hurricane. And a lot of people, particularly African Americans, did not move back. So we don't have good data on the number of people moving. And we have zero data on people who are moving right now because of climate change. Is my sister who moved to San Antonio, is she a climate migrant? Or I don't know. Or is it just a disaster displacement? Or just something else? So, and finally, we don't know what to call people. We don't know what to call people who move because of climate change. Are they climate migrants, environmental migrants? Legally, there are lots of issues. They're not refugees, even those who crossed borders under the 1951 Refugee Convention, which says you're a refugee for one of 5 reasons: race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. Nothing about climate or environment. There is no international framework on mobility associated with climate change. The Pacific Islands have just this week finished working on a regional framework for climate migration. And maybe there will be other regional initiatives, but there's a real lack of international law and legal guidance on this issue.
That's we're told that the extreme weather and climate is going to get worse. It's not going to go backwards. And do you have a crystal ball on if it gets worse? Do you see any governments that are either local or nationally or statewide that are taking any action to kind of plan for that and plan for the mobility and displacement? Are there, for example, entire communities? Is there displacement? Anybody on the floodplains to move those folks, or what are you seeing from governments?
Well, several things. First of all, we know that climate change is increasing the severity, the spatial reach, the intensity, the frequency of these severe sudden onset weather-related disasters. We know that that pattern is clearly established. What we can't say, though, is that a single event, say Hurricane Ian, was caused by climate change. We've always had hurricanes long before human-induced climate change. We've always had droughts. But, climate scientists are beginning to come up with percentages. And now they say, for example, that Hurricane Harvey in 2017 was 40% due to climate change. They're looking at historical patterns and so forth. So we know we're going to have more of these severe weather events. By and large, I think governments have done a pretty good job at working on these sudden onset disasters. Most countries have a national defense disaster management mechanism, whether it's FEMA in the United States or Protección Civil and in Central America, where they plan for this and have good rescue teams or efforts. We seem to be better at rescuing people sometimes than at anticipating and preventing these disasters from happening. But this also raises some kind of ethical issues. Do we owe more to people displaced by weather-related events caused by climate change, or where climate change contributes to these weather events, than to non-climate change environmental hazards like earthquakes? Does somebody fleeing a storm have more call on our resources than somebody fleeing an earthquake? All the discussion about climate migrants really leaves out people who are affected by volcanoes, tsunamis, earthquakes. So, when you come up with policies, it becomes difficult to define who you're talking about and who should have access, and do we owe more to people because of the effects of climate change? So there are lots of questions that are raised about this, but I think people are planning for displacement. Most governments, local and state governments, have evacuation shelters long in advance of storms. We're going to need more of that and more sensitivity to how they're planned and where. We know, for example, that gender-based violence always increases after natural disasters, partly because shelters may be crowded and social norms break down and other factors. But, usually it happens at a time when the police are busy with other things and the shelters for battered spouses are closed and the hotlines don't work. And anyway, so there are things that we can do to strengthen our ability to respond. I think the real challenge is with these slow onset things, the coastal erosion and the drought. How do you prepare for that? And politicians, I think, have an interest in quick results. They want programs that show that they're responding to a disaster. But things that may take 10 or 20 years to develop, that's going to be on probably another politician's radar screen. And so we see less actions, particularly these non-sexy infrastructure challenges for politicians. In New Orleans, for example, there was a lot more interest in investing in tourism and shipping before Katrina than in maintaining the antiquated pumps that the city used to keep the streets dry, and we saw the consequences of that.
We had a question, Beth, that came in on the complacency by people, especially those who think that climate change is a myth and it doesn't exist. Are you seeing any shift in attitudes among people that are maybe more accepting to climate change as the floodwaters get closer to them?
Yeah, I think that, it's really a shame that climate change has become a politicized issue, because it really isn't, What we've seen in some places, such as Southern Florida, is instead of talking about climate change, you talk about floods. I mean, everybody can understand the dangers of flooding. It doesn't seem to come with the political baggage that climate change sometimes brings. So you can talk about preparing for floods or preparing for diminishing coastlines. You know, and I'll say on the policy front, I think the real front lines in this struggle on climate migration are going to be local governments. They're going to be municipalities and mayors that have to decide, you know, do we let people settle in this area that's probably going to be eroded in 10 years? And these two can become very, very politicized. In 2017, the Coastal Commission in California issued a report that talked about the possibility of managed retreat, moving away from the coast, given the impact of climate change and what's likely to happen. This became highly political, very controversial. People don't want to talk about retreat. Nobody wants to be forced to leave their homes. So it's very difficult to talk about, but at some point, I think communities are going to have to grapple with the fact that, you know, do we continue to experience these hazards year after year, or do we think about moving somewhere else?
Well, thank you for your insight.
Not very cheerful, I'm sorry.
I think we learned a lot, but it's time to wrap up your section. But we really appreciate it, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and expertise with us.
You're welcome.
We're going to move on to Sanjay Notani. Sanjay is from India, and he's a leading voice on climate change and trade law in India and internationally. Sometimes when we think about climate change, we think about the floods and water and droughts, and sometimes we don't dig down deep enough to think about trade. How is climate impacting trade? He has in-depth experience in advising multinational companies on the trade and climate. And he's an ABA member. He's appointed to the ABA Steering Committee on Export Controls and Economic Sanctions Committee. He's the vice chair of the ABA South Asia, Oceania, and Indian Committee. Sanjay, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Richard.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you is to begin with, before we get into all the trade things that you're an expert at, is how is climate change affecting India?
So first of all, thank you, Richard, ABA, and being in the midst of all the wonderful panelists. As far as India is concerned, like all other countries, we've seen a sea change, you know, and to be very true, as much as politics keeps on playing itself, but literally on the ground, if you see, in the name of infrastructure, people are building all kinds of bridges, all the coastal roads and kinds of, you know, doubling all the road sizes and stuff like that. But on the ground, literally, I do not know to what extent is the environment impact assessment happening on the ground. And to that extent, you know, over a period of years, we're seeing the kind of changes on the ground. And I agree with what Beth said, that, you know, clearly on the diplomatic stage, international law does not recognize climate refugees under the 1951 Convention or the 1967 Protocol. Now, within the Indian context, I completely agree what's happening globally is happening in India, that, you know, climate-induced migration can be broadly divided into two categories. One is the category of the migrants who are forced to move from rural areas to urban areas as a result of an environmental disaster that may have destroyed their homes or farms. And India being a agri-populated country, and we are seeing the kinds of disasters people are having on the farmlands, environment, weather playing truant. There are enormous losses. We've seen a lot of suicides by farmers. So, you know, literally the next generation of the farmer is saying, what am I doing here? I need to move to the city. And that's exactly. Now, clearly, we don't have numbers, you know, given that India, while of course, I'm not going to sort of, you know, repeat this, but India has history, India has geography, and India has people. So where do we get these statistics right? And that is where, you can see that the refuge which people are taking in mega cities is just creating a lot of problem. In a case of city like Mumbai, which is where we come from, we've seen over a period of time a number of migrants from the south of the land have moved up to the city as a result of the land degradation and desertification back home, while migrants from the north have largely moved owing to the drought. And of course, now let's go to the second category of climate-induced migrants, which is relevant to migrants who move from bordering countries such as Bangladesh in search of a better life in India, which is what Brian also spoke about, Mexico, people moving to Canada and then into the US. That is what is happening. But let's also get some of these facts real, that Bangladesh is one of the world's most natural disaster-prone countries. A fourth of its land is just 5 feet above sea level, while 2/3 is less than 15 feet above sea level. In the last 3 decades, close to 1 million people have rendered homeless as a consequence of increasing erosion in the Brahmaputra river basin, which is one of the largest rivers out there. And it is estimated that about 50 to 120 million migrants may end up becoming climate refugees between Bangladesh and in India. So clearly, climate change is, clearly poised to become a sizable force in shaping the future demographical patterns of India. And hence, comprehensive policies are required to stem the plight of climate migrants in India.
So, well, how does trade play into this? That's one of your expertise with climate migration and trade.
So as far as climate migration and trade is concerned, let me be very honest. In terms of the law, first of all, let me be honest. I don't think, even if I go on the basis of Article 21 of the Constitution, which guarantees, the fundamental right to life, has been expanded to include a right to a clean and a pollution-free environment. But that's just in writing. Going to the courts and getting things organized in terms of migrants is a long overdue subject. When you go to the courts will say it's an executive function. Go to the government. When you go to the government will say we have no answers about it. We'll set up committees and panels. By the time, literally what has happened to the migrants, we do not know. The next batch of the migrants are ready. So in terms of law and in terms of migration, I think it's more political. It's more and hogwash and an eyewash, the way things are. No statistics, absolutely, which will sort of make you do the right studies. And that's a problem that we are all dealing with out there.
Well, in every crisis, there's both challenges and opportunities. And what are those challenges and opportunities that are presented to businesses?
So let me come straight to some of the things on the opportunity side and positive side, which we would like to see in the coming future is, of course, in the COP meeting in Glasgow, the Prime Minister of India, of course, announced the 5-fold strategy. And the term which he used it's an Hindi word known as Panchamrit. That means 5 kinds of solutions or 5 kinds of things which he has lined up as far as climate change is concerned. One is, he wants to he's committed to say reaching about 500 gigawatts of non-fossil energy capacity by 2030, 50% of its energy requirements from renewable energy by 2030, reduction of total projected carbon emissions by about 1 billion tons from now to 2030, reduction of carbon intensity of the emission by 45% by 2030 or over 2005 levels. And lastly, achieving the target of net emissions by 2070. Now, this involves a lot of change on the ground by all the stakeholders, whether it's the government, whether it's the industries, whether it's people, the civil rights society. Everybody needs to sort of play a role. And what India has started doing is right in the game of it. it has brought about a lot of changes in its legislations in order to achieve these goals. Recently, in terms of carbon taxes, there have been discussions on bringing out carbon taxes so that ultimately we can penalize the people who sort of are contributing to the carbon emission or the greenhouse gases. Because India, given the history of using fossil fuel, is crazy, and so clearly they are bringing out these kinds of changes. In terms of carbon trading, again, the Indian Parliament recently passed the Energy Conservation Bill 2022, which now ensures that there is clearly a boost and a use of non-fossil fuel energy, including the green hydrogen and green ammonia, to reduce the imports of fuels needed to power the country. There has been a sea change of regulations coming in by a Bureau of Energy Efficiency, an agency that handles the framing of rules and standards regarding energy, to create a domestic carbon trading system so that ultimately it can help people to get carbon trading certificates and take care of that. And lastly, recently a report by the Promotion Council of India has generated, which says that approximately 30 million carbon credits, which is the second highest transacted volume in the world, has been reported. And further, India is expected to gain at least $5 to $10 billion from carbon trading. So these are the kinds of sea changes which we have seen, and ultimately, to some part or the other, given that people have also understood, while the concept of ESG, according to me, is more corporatized rather than the word sustainability. So, on the ground, we are seeing that people, and most prominently stakeholders, such as the shareholders, such as the independent directors, such as consumers, now are asking these companies to, literally give us what is right, what is sustainable, rather than just throwing things upon us. So those are the kinds of changes and activism as far as things on the ground we are getting to see.
Well, I can imagine that the challenges are fairly great with the large population that you have and the demographics there. But I want to go over to your global engagements now, and multilateral engagements and the sustainability in the future. And how is that looking?
So historically, of course, we've never had a climate topic as a part of a multilateral discussion. While yes, thankfully, the Paris Climate brought about the sea change. COP26 is out there. We're going to see commitments being sort of put on the table. We've seen recently the NDCs which have been submitted by the government, which puts India has put forth some of these climate change goals. And according to an updated NDC, which is the nationally determined contribution, India is committed to reduce the emission intensity of its GDP to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. And to that extent, when I talk about these things, one is on the trade side. India has become very hungry for technology, and it is buying or it is ready to accept technologies which can help, rather than go back to the fossil fuel production for energy and stuff. There's a lot of investments in terms of hydrogen and hydrogen kind of solutions out there. There's a lot of technology over EV cars which are being sort of looked around. And as from as on a multilateral stage is concerned, besides the Paris Climate, what India is also doing is it's signing a lot of free trade agreements with a lot of countries bilaterally. So India never had this kind of a sort of a paragraph ever included in any of these agreements. But today, India is talking about it, and India does not have, of course, any binding commitments on sustainability related provisions. However, in the recent India-UAE FTA has provisions on cooperation regarding environment-related matters on a best endeavor basis. But of course, it will take time to see what do you mean by best endeavor, which does not define anything. But one of the agreements which we are due to discuss and negotiate next year is with the EU. And what EU has done is basically in its trade policy review of 2021, EU Commission has put forward climate neutrality as a goal for trade agreements within the G20 members and made compliance with the Paris Agreement on an essential elements of FTAs, because apparently G20 contributes almost 80% of the greenhouse gases. So there are very tough questions being asked to India. There are being very tough questions which India will have to answer, and which it is doing. Means the recent reports have shown that India, as much as possible, what it has committed, has already moved up in the value chain to try and work on sustainable methods of giving climate. And these are the kinds of things Europe is asking, other countries are asking, and pretty much I think with the pulls and pushes, we will be able to sort of settle some of these trade issues on a multilateral front as well as on a bilateral front.
Sanjay, I've heard that the heat is increasing in India, and that is affecting the farmers, and that consequently affects the food supply and the migration to the cities. I think you talked a little bit about the migration to the cities. But what about the food supply?
As far as the food supply is concerned, let's go on the basis that the weather has been playing absolutely dangerous on farmers. What people used to grow clearly has impacted the kind of produce which we would like to see is not happening. The other thing, what has changed is also the demand. What exactly are people asking for farmers to grow? And that has confused the community at large, because if they go to the market saying, oh, we are producing sugar, but ultimately, no, we are looking for avocados or we are looking for mangoes, and that is what we want from you. And clearly the soil, the weather, the kind of stuff, clearly there is a mix of all things happening on the ground. So on the food chain, what we are getting to see is either there is in one part of the country, because India is huge in geography. And so if you go to the north, there's a lot of production of wheat. Now, if you see, as far as the production of wheat is concerned, while yes, there may be bumper production of wheat, but at the same time, if you go to the next season, there will be a glut. And, I don't want to sort of make this a line of discussion on India's food crisis as a security measure, because recently you may have got to hear that because of the crisis between Russia and Ukraine and the whole food crisis which was happening globally, India just decided to sort of shut its exports of all the kinds of stuff which it could have sort of exported to the other countries. But that's a food crisis which was globally. Now, if you take it back home, either there's too much of wheat or there's less of rice, or if there is less of rice, then there is something else which is sort of playing this kind of a nuance that exactly what people want and what farmers want is not sort of catching it up. And that's the crisis we are all dealing with.
We have about a minute left, but do you tell us about any projection about the food crisis globally?
As far as food crisis globally is concerned, I'm not the right person to speak, but what I can just definitely from my perspectives give you a sort of I think at a multilateral level, there are many sort of issues at the WTO on the agriculture and subsidies, which still needs to be settled. And that, according to me, is playing more politically, geopolitically, which has sort of created this whole thing where every country decides to, in the name of security, decides to sort of store or do not, come out in the open and do the right stuff in terms of the global crisis. The second thing is, I think there needs to be, while we are discussing climate, I think a multilateral agency needs to sort of come and interplay in terms of, because the effects of climate are there and the effects of climate on food is going to be felt enormously amongst all other things. I think we need a global action to see how exactly this needs to be balanced. It can't be that everybody grows the same thing, and it cannot be that everybody decides in the name of security not to do that. So I think there requires to be a discussion, there requires a deliberation, there requires some sort of an deep thinking and documentation on exactly how we are going to manage these things, because the road from here is clearly going to be not an easy road, and it's going to be leading to a lot of crises. And that's something which we should try and see amongst all other things of immigration and crisis and migrants. I think food is another one subject that we need to understand.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We're out of time on your segment, Sanjay, but thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your expertise, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
The next speaker we have to bring you is Dr. Lisa Doggett. Dr. Doggett is a family practitioner and longtime advocate for health and social responsibility. She's the co-founder of Texas Physicians for Social Responsibility. She is the author of Up the Down Escalator, A Doctor's Navigates Disease and Disorder. And she's the author of a recent NPR article called Stressed Out About Climate Change. Actually, I read that article, and that's one of the reasons I asked Lisa to,
oh my God,
to come on to the panel with us, because it's an area that we don't hear every day, and it's critically important. So Lisa, let me ask you, I know you have some slides that you want to show us, but before we do that, you've written that climate change is the biggest public health crisis of our time, and it threatens to impact every person on the planet now and in the foreseeable future. And I know that you've done a lot of work on how climate change affects our physical and mental health. So can you speak to us in your time on that, as well as what we as individuals can do to make a positive difference in our lives to better deal with the climate change?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here. I do want to mention I have an unstable internet connection, which is rather random. I'm on a lot of Zoom calls all the time. I don't know why it's happening now, but Murphy's Law or something. So if I get disconnected, maybe you can go to the Q&A and then I'll come back on as soon as possible. I just want to mention that because it could happen. I've gotten kicked off twice in the last 15 minutes. Anyway, back to the questions. Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to share the health perspective about the climate crisis. I feel like this is the biggest public health crisis that we've faced, certainly during our lifetimes, and are going to continue to face for the foreseeable future. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to some slides. I think that will kind of help guide this discussion a little bit. Does that sound okay?
Perfect.
All right, let's see if we can get this to work. All right, are you seeing my screen?
We're good.
Great. All right. So, you know, I think we've heard some really fascinating and helpful presentations about a lot of the impacts of climate change facing us, but I really do want us to focus on the health impacts, which I think are extremely important, but often overlooked. So certainly when we think about climate change and global warming, we think about heat-related illness, and that is a major problem right now. We're seeing increasing frequency, duration, and intensity of heat events. The past 7 years have been the hottest on record, and in the past 20 years, we've seen a 54% increase in heat-related mortality among people over 65. And of course, that's the most vulnerable age group, but people who are, who are homeless, or younger people with
It looks like Lisa has frozen, and I think the ABA is trying to help her get back her connection. And we can, in waiting for her, because she has some really good slides, I hope everybody can see them, but
28,000 deaths due to the heat, beyond what we would have expected otherwise. So
Lisa, can I interrupt you? You froze a minute ago.
Oh
so
gosh.
We can't see the slide that you're referring to. Can you put it back on?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't know what is going on. Okay, let's see.
It never fails.
I know, I've had bad luck the last couple times. All right. Are you seeing my screen again?
Yep, we have the health effects of climate change.
So yeah, I was just talking about kind of heat-related illness. Most recent example of this is the 28,000 excess deaths in England related to the excess of heat over the summer. We also hear a lot about the spread of vector and waterborne diseases. So vector-borne diseases are those that come through like mosquitoes, ticks, flies. Examples would include Zika, which I never heard of in medical school in the 90s, but certainly we are now all too familiar with Zika. We are seeing West Nile virus in many parts of Texas now, where we just didn't see West Nile virus before. That's a mosquito-borne illness that can cause very severe disease. We've talked a lot about intensity of natural disasters, and there's some controversy about whether the frequencies increase, but we definitely know the intensity of natural disasters like hurricanes and wildfires has increased dramatically. We're seeing higher pollen counts and longer allergy seasons. That's a big deal in Texas, where we really have bad allergy seasons already. Any organ system can be impacted, but particularly the kidneys and the heart are at high risk as a result of climate change. And then finally, there's this issue of air pollution. Air pollution contributes a lot to climate change, but also results from climate change. So, air pollution in and of itself causes about 7 million excess deaths every year, according to the World Health Organization. And part of the problem is that high temperatures increase ground level ozone, which is one of the major contributors to climate change. We think of ozone, ozone is smog, kind of more common term for it. And many of you are familiar with ozone action days, which are more common in the warm months. Ozone can have negative impacts on the heart and lungs, and even increase the risk of low birth weight babies. So there are lots of different health impacts. All right. This is a great slide from the CDC that shows the different ways that climate change can impact human health. So in addition to some of the ones I've mentioned, we also have like malnutrition from impact on water and food supplies. There's the water quality impact, which I mentioned briefly, but those include things like cholera, cryptosporosis, and other waterborne infections. And then, of course, there's the issues with forced migration and environmental degradation, which, of course, have health impact as well. So, Richard, you asked me to talk about mental health of climate change, and that's certainly an area of interest of mine. I think it's even more often overlooked than the general health impact of climate change. And yet it's really, really important. So when we think about major natural disasters, there's often the immediate impact of people being displaced and people being, injured or even being killed from a hurricane or a fire. But those kinds of events can lead to long-term mental illness. Displacement, disease, disruption of food and water supplies all have major impacts on mental health as well. And then there's the existential impact. So people worry, and probably some of you are worried, and that's maybe why you're here, about things like mass extinction, our own future, our children's future, the end of civilization. I mean, we can catastrophize, and some of that is, maybe extreme, but some of it may not be that extreme, and it can cause quite a bit of anxiety. So the effects of all this can include, certainly acute traumatic stress disorder, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder. You can also see dysthymia, which is just kind of like a low-level depression, generalized anxiety disorder, major depression, panic disorder, hypochondriasis, and insomnia are all some of the well-known impacts of climate change. You often indirect, but sometimes worrying about climate change can trigger bigger issues that are listed here. Real quick, we did talk quite a bit about migrants, and I think that is really an important consideration. Often the poorest and the most vulnerable communities are the hardest hit by the climate crisis. Climate change is really considered a threat multiplier, so it exacerbates existing risks. It also creates new ones. And then we think about this kind of internal displacement, now even more likely due to climate change than even from conflict. all of this leads to physical and mental health challenges. So are you still hearing me okay?
We're good, yeah.
Okay, awesome. So just a little bit about my work. You mentioned Texas Physicians for Social Responsibility. We are a chapter of the National PSR organization based in DC. That organization has been around since the 1960s, and its focus has really always been on the gravest threats to human health. In the 60s, that was defined as prevention of nuclear war. Unfortunately, we are still needing to work on prevention of nuclear war. In fact, right now, more than almost any other time, unfortunately, given the situation with Russia. But we also focus quite a bit on climate change, and especially here in our Texas chapter of PSR. A lot of our work is through advocacy and education. And we've done a lot in Texas on particularly around advocacy and education, educating the general public as well as other physicians and lawmakers. More recently, we've had a great partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund to work on federal policy. We've had a call to action where we had over 200 physicians and health organizations sign on to a letter asking for stronger federal policies on climate change. And we created the Texas Climate 2040 report, which we published last fall. I think the thing that I'm the most proud of that we've done with Texas PSR is our educational efforts. So as a medical student in the 1990s, I didn't learn anything about climate change. I didn't learn anything about the environment. And yet those are incredibly important issues that all physicians need to know about. So we've really tried to correct that with our PSR work. And we formed a partnership back in 2020 with the Dell Medical School here in Austin, where we offer an environmental health elective now. We recruited volunteer lecturers, mostly physicians, but some others who are experts on various aspects of environmental health. And we also require an advocacy component. So we have a talk about advocacy, and then we encourage the students as part of their project to write a letter to the editor or meet with a member of Congress or their staff, and in order to really start to make change, not just learn about it. Other Texas medical schools have heard about it and have joined us, so that now we have 2 other medical schools, Baylor College of Medicine, which is my alma mater, I'm proud to say, and UT Southwestern. They have offered their first elective this last spring. UT San Antonio is also starting one, and we're talking with several medical schools about doing something similar and or getting content from these kinds of lectures incorporated into the general curriculum, which is our ultimate goal. So this slide just shows what our recruitment flyer looked like in the first time we did the elective, as well as some of the topics covered. We included things like, we had 2 lectures specifically on climate change. I did a talk on air and water pollution, which obviously I've mentioned has some major impacts on climate change. There's a lot of connection there. But we also focused on mental health and the impact of environmental health on maternal and fetal wellness and health. So there were a lot of different ways that we incorporated different medical topics into the elective. So just a moment, you did ask a little bit about kind of what you can do about it. And, I think personally, it is important to take some action. It's important for all of us to think about ways to reduce our carbon footprint. So I would encourage all of you to think about using public transit more, biking, walking, recycling whenever you can. Reducing air travel. Air travel is the way that most of us have our biggest carbon footprint. And air travel is a major, major problem. So when we can cut back on air travel and have more Zoom meetings when the technology works, that's a good thing. Following a plant-based diet is another way to help make an impact. Agriculture is a huge contributor to the climate crisis, particularly through methane emissions. Choose renewable energy like solar panels. Choose electric vehicles, reduce consumption overall, shop locally, and then of course, vote, get other people to vote and advocate for change. It's not enough just to take these personal actions. We have to really push for bigger and better public policies. Finally, if you, like me, suffer from a bit of this eco-anxiety, I think it's also important to take personal action to reduce and deal with that eco-anxiety. And I've talked with some psychiatrists in writing the article that was published by NPR about how to do that. So, they really recommend stress reduction overall. If you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be effective as an advocate in pushing for important changes. So you can do that by meditation, particularly mindfulness practices are really great and important, and evidence-based medicine in terms of improving health. Prayer, exercise, healthy diet, all great ways to help reduce your own stress and improve your self-care. You can seek out others. So look for opportunities in your local community to do advocacy to improve, reduce the community's carbon footprint. There are these new organizations called climate cafes that bring people together to talk about their concerns around climate. There's also something called the Good Grief Network, which supports local action. So you can look these up and see if they're an option in your community or potentially even as an online resource. Focus on short-term success and not just the long-term goals, and try to keep things in perspective. So, one of the psychiatrists I talked to said, we have to really remember that despite all of these challenges, we really are living in the best time. So when you think about overall poverty, overall pollution, those have decreased significantly. And in fact, before the pandemic, we had the highest life expectancy we'd ever had. So we do see some great improvements in terms of quality of life overall, and we need to keep that in mind even while we take action to reduce climate change. So that's it for my slides, but I'm certainly glad to just talk more or take any other questions.
Lisa, I have a question, and we do have some time for questions and answers for the panel. But
Great.
we got one that came in on the Q&A. It says, how could law schools begin to incorporate the class elective that Texas PSR has encouraged?
Oh my gosh, that would be fantastic. Well, I don't know enough about the law school curriculum, but I'm sure that there are a whole lot of different ways that, that lawyers are impacted and that they need to know about climate change as well. So, it'd be a great thing that we could brainstorm on. In fact, the director of Texas PSR is herself an attorney. She'd be a really good person to be able to collaborate with about that. You can reach out to us through www.texaspsr.org. You can also contact me on my website, which is lisadoggett.com, and I'd be glad to talk about more specifics. But one of the things that we're doing, I think having an elective is a good way to start. So you can bring in people who are knowledgeable, just like those on this panel, to talk about these issues with future lawyers. The other thing that we're doing is we've created at UT Southwestern, which is the first medical school in Texas to agree to bring in climate education to the general curriculum. We're creating about 2 slides for each lecture on major organ systems that lecturers can insert easily without having to do a lot of adjustment to their lecture. So they can just incorporate two slides about how each of those organ systems is impacted by climate change. That way you have continuity throughout the semester as you're learning about pathophysiology, and having that constant reminder about how climate change is important and has multiple impacts. So something similar like that, make it easy, and starting out with an elective, but reach out. I'd love to talk more about that.
I have a suggestion. You may think about starting a model project. I mean, instead of going nationwide, that's the best way to do it. And University of Texas here in Austin has a new dean. You may or may not know that, and he's very progressive. And you may reach out to him. I'd be happy to go with you to talk about this project if you want to do that. We have another, you're very popular at the Q&A, Lisa. The other question is, can you talk a little about disabilities and climate migration? Is climate change responsible for people developing impairments? What might be the unique challenges for climate migrants with disabilities?
Well, certainly, there are multiple ways that people can end up with disabilities, usually indirectly related to climate change. But if they're in a natural disaster, they could have an injury. If they have an infectious condition like West Nile virus, they could end up with neurologic damage as a result of that. And then, of course, heat illnesses can lead to things like heat stroke, which has a high mortality rate, but certainly people can survive, but have disabilities as a result. There are many, many ways that people can end up with disabilities as a result of, climate change indirectly. And that increases the chance of difficulty with having to move, with being displaced. So, I think it's a really, really tricky issue. The other thing I want to mention is that mental illness is a major reason for people to be disabled as well. And certainly, people, when they're depressed or if they have PTSD, that can have a major limitation on their ability to work and have a high quality of life. So I think those are all ways that climate change can contribute to disability. And of course, that impacts migration. Dr. Ferris might have something to add to that. I'm curious to hear if you wanted to contribute to that as well.
Yeah, on the disability question, I think a big issue is that people with disabilities won't be able to move as much, that they'll be more restricted to place and fall into that trapped population category. I don't know how you want to handle the rest of the questions, Richard. There are a lot of them in the Q&A.
Yeah, one of the questions that we're looking at, and we can't answer all of them, but that's why we're on you. Maybe you have an answer, and it has to do with climate migration in terms of asylum cases, I assume in the United States. Are you aware of any either asylum for climate migration currently, or that may be in the works in the future?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that are happening. One is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is developing guidance for how to deal with people who shouldn't be returned to their countries because of the climate situation or disasters and so forth. The most important court cases, though, have come in New Zealand, where people from Pacific Islands have asked for refugee status, asylum on the basis of climate concerns. Those have been rejected by the New Zealand courts, finding that they don't satisfy the requirements for refugee status. But the UN Human Rights Committee has suggested that should be taken into consideration. I think this is an area where we're going to see a lot of jurisprudence in the next couple of years as more and more of these claims grow. But right now, so far, it hasn't been grounds for asylum in the US.
Byron, we have a question that came in for you. Are there positive impacts from climate change in Canada, such as shorter winters, longer growing seasons, more access to Arctic areas, and are they counterbalanced by other impacts?
Thanks, Richard. Great question. And unfortunately, the best I can say is we don't really know, at least I certainly don't know at this point. Shorter winters may be good, may be bad. One of the, back to the water resources question, shorter winters means less snow. Water in the form of snow gets absorbed into the watersheds a lot slower than water in the form of rain, which tends to sit on hard ground and run off quickly. So the ability for Canada to preserve its water resources may well depend on there being ongoing longer winters. And without those water resources, it could be a significant problem for the country going forward. Same with the Arctic. There are economists and business people who like the idea of the Arctic being ice-free because of the shipping lanes it opens up. But is that a positive? It's hard to imagine the impact on the indigenous people, the impact on the ecosystems up there of that. So it is really difficult, at least with somebody with the limited imagination that I have, to be able to say at the end of the day, I can see positives coming out of this. The human, and back to Dr. Doggett's comment, it isn't all bleak. And the human nature is such, we are incredibly good at adapting. We are incredibly smart at figuring out ways to deal with change. But it's so much of what we're seeing is difficult because there is so much data that we don't quite understand at this point.
So would you say that we're in the infancy of understanding climate change, the data, what needs to be done to sustain our planet? It's really hard to answer a general question like that. The scientists out there
know way more than the general population does, and have for years. You know, there's been comments about climate change going back a few hundred years, and about the impact. The real challenge, and I know there was another question that was directed at me about, you know, it almost sounded like, and I'm paraphrasing the question, that I was almost apologizing for the fact that much of what Canada's problems are ones that aren't in our control. It wasn't meant to be an apology for Canada. It was meant to be more to explain the difficulties that even politicians with good intentions have in trying to get change. Ultimately, I go back to Lisa's comment, get out and vote. We are Western democracies, the biggest emitters. And as Western democracies, politicians are going to respond to their voters. And if we don't educate, if we don't bring that detailed scientific level of knowledge down to the level of the voters, we're unlikely to see much progress at the political level at the end of the day. And that's a huge challenge in an era where what is true is increasingly questioned at the end of the day. And it is a bit of a depressing comment, I realize, but really I'm a firm believer that it's the level of education that is one of the most important grassroots things we can do to move this in the right direction.
There's another question that has come in, and Sanjay, maybe you can field this one. Because of your international work, are there specific steps to address climate displacement on the agenda at the upcoming COP27 meeting? And what are they? And if you don't know the answer to that one, then any other international bodies that maybe are addressing the issue?
So one of the sidetrack discussions which we have is, of course, the climate effects and the trade. And particularly when you talk about the trade, it is not only limited to goods moving here and there, but it's also on people and services. So yes, there is going to be some sort of an action and discussion. I do not know to what extent we will get to see results or the impact of it. But that's something which we will have to wait and watch. I just wanted 2 seconds just to get back on Lisa and about lawyers and stuff. You know, one of the things what I completely advocate is whatever you need to do outside first, you should start from your own home. So young people in our law firms, they are very much need of the hour. They understand, they are very active on issues like this. So what they have done is they have gone and actually adopted a village and ensured that they can have their own energy from their own renewable energy in terms of solar panels, and they don't need to rely upon government. They don't need to rely on anything, and the cost of giving that electricity is just pointers. So, for lawyers who keep on talking about for companies doing ESG projects and stuff like that, I think it's important to start at home. Talk about starting courses with colleges, because it's important that environment becomes a subject, becomes a major subject, not only a side subject that should be done. And lastly, from an international perspective, we see some of the global environment cases. And it's interesting to note, and I'll just talk about one of them, which is a historic climate change lawsuit, which was filed by a Peruvian farmer, Sol Luciano, is suing a German energy company, RWEAG, for the cost of preventing the glacial lake in his country from flooding his hometown, which is in Peru, but the effects are coming from Germany. Now, that's a case that we need to wait and watch, because ultimately, I completely agree with Brian. It's the education. Now, how do you get the education? Either you get it as simply as possible on the ground, or otherwise, cases like this or the cases like Shell will push companies will push the government will push the legislations, and ultimately those are the ways you will get to see the effects coming to everybody.
Well, we have like 1 minute left, and I want to thank everyone, all your Sanjay, Brian, Dr. Ferris, and Dr. Doggett. Thank you for the presentations you've made. I think the audience and I have now realized that climate change is much deeper, much broader than what we initially thought. I'd like to thank the audience. Thank you for joining us today, and thank the ABA Commission on Civil Rights and Social Justice for providing this and putting it on. It advocates nationwide, the ABA, it advocates nationwide on critical issues. And if you're looking for a home in the ABA, go to join our section. It's at AMBAR/CRSJ. It's the social conscience of the ABA, and you're always welcome and join a committee. And with that, we'd like to wish everybody well. And again, thank you to the speakers and thank you for joining us, and have a good day.